I wanted to talk today about what I see as two national disgraces. And the first one being the national disgrace of John Fitzgerald Kennedy being gunned down in the city 50 years ago. The second national disgrace is the 50 years of lies we have endured from the government and the corporate media covering up the first disgrace. The Earl Warrens, the Gerald Fords, the Arlen Spectors, the Alan Dulleses, as well as those from the media industrial complex. The Gerald Posners, the Max Hollinses, the McAdamses, the O'Reillys, the Bugliosis, the Forrest Gumps, and all the others among the tenured historians and academics, commentators and journalists who refuse to acknowledge the fraud of the Warren Commission and have therefore become what Sylvia Meagher called accessories after the fact. Historian Robert Dallek, who I've met at the Kennedy Library, and I find him to be a fine historian, a gentleman, a liberal, whatever. He sums up the JFK assassination this way. You might have seen him on some of the documentaries they showed last night. The fact that none of the conspiracy theorists have been able to offer convincing evidence of their suspicions does not seem to trouble many people. The plausibility of a conspiracy is less important to them than the implausibility of someone as inconsequential as Oswald having the wherewithal to kill someone as consequential, as powerful and well-guarded as Kennedy. To accept that an act of random violence by an obscure malcontent could bring down a president of the United States is to acknowledge a chaotic, disorderly world that frightens most Americans. Here, Dallek provides a rehash of what's become the mainstream academic argument among mainstream historians, American historians. And I know this quite well, trust me. My colleagues, they don't go there. The killing of Kennedy, in their view, was not a political assassination, but a random act of violence, and that, quote, most Americans have conjured conspiracy theories out of thin air to give meaning to an act that is essentially meaningless, or as Dallek states, because they are frightened. Is anybody in this room frightened?
Well, I'm more frightened of a military coup than I am of a blown gun.
So maybe it's the Warren Commission enthusiasts who are the frightened ones. As one critic of the Warren Commission noted, to acknowledge that an organized conspiracy had occurred was to recognize that it had been done for a purpose, to change government policy. Having told the world for so many years how wonderful we all are, here in the greatest country in the world, the media people were not willing to admit that our national leader could be removed in such a brutal fashion in order to change government policy. That would put the lie to American democracy. That just could not be. Therefore, in their minds, the assassination had to be a random event, the work of a deranged loner. You can flip that argument directly on its head. And when you see people on TV, you know, it's like Cyril Reck the other night, it was fabulous how he was able to counter the sophistry that's coming from his people. It should be crystal clear to anybody who has studied the Warren report that the Commission blew a lot of smoke around the facts in the case, with its non-indexed 26 volumes and its selective 800-page report. This is a historical record. This isn't conjecture. This is what we have. They're still apologizing for this commission, right? Upton Sinclair said 100 years ago, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. Professional reputations are at stake, after all, and heaven forfend if one might be barred from appearing on Meet the Press or the PBS NewsHour. That sums up my colleagues' cowardice among tenure academics. What is the purpose? Tony Judd used to say that the only purpose of tenure is to protect unpopular speech, unpopular, you know what I'm saying? And these guys are going right with the stream, and I call them tenured cowards. Warren Commission might not have been curious enough to question an FBI agent who had met up with Jack Ruby for the better part of a year, but they were keenly interested in other aspects of Ruby's life. For example, in viewing Commission Exhibit number 1281 in volume 22 of the Commission's findings, released by the FBI on February 18, 1964, a dogged researcher will learn, based on records from Elgin State Hospital in Illinois, dated January 15, 1938, that Ruby's mother, Fanny Rubenstein, wore false teeth. The commission furnished a diagram showing 32 teeth with a notation by Dr. W.J. Hoff, the staff dentist, who examined Mrs. Rubenstein. Patient states she has teeth but not wearing them, unquote. So among the countless leads that the Warren Commission investigators failed to look into, they nonetheless got to the bottom of the condition of Fanny Rubenstein's choppers 25 years before the Kennedy assassination. Now, my interpretation of that is the Balins and the Lieblers and the Specters and them, and I'm sorry, forgive me for saying this, they're saying, fuck you to the American people by including this in a report that was sadly important for our country. Our president was killed, and they're putting the dental records from the 30s in the commission exhibits. And that's the record. That's the historical record. That's not me creating a conspiracy because I couldn't accept the meaninglessness of the John Kennedy stuff. Warren Commission showed less interest in Jack Ruby's ties with the Dallas Police Department than they did with his mother's oral hygiene, and maybe the issue of whether or not someone from inside the police station had let Ruby into the basement to dispatch Oswald, as he did on national television, in the words of Mark Lane, required a radical inquiry. The commission blandly accepted at face value a short statement from Chief Curry, the guy who was responsible for the botched transfer of the world's most famous prisoner. Curry claimed that Ruby knew no more than 25 to 50 Dallas of the policemen of the 1,200. We're told by the so-called debunkers that the Dallas Police Department in 1963 solved the case through their swift, sure police work. Yet this same force not only allowed Oswald to be shot dead in their custody, it failed to record Oswald's 12-hour interrogation and did not identify, fingerprint, or photograph multiple suspects found in the exact area where these 77 witnesses, right out here, said they heard a gunshot or saw a gunshot.
No notes.
The Warren Commission chicanery has been followed by 50 years of sophistry from its defenders up to the state. Now this reminds me of what Dr. Aguilar's brilliant presentation earlier that I caught. The so-called scientific recreations of assassination that I've seen on CBS News and other media outlets recently, where they put a lot of garbage into a computer, create a cartoon, and then inevitably conclude that Oswald did what the Warren Commission said he did, because they use the superficial aura of science, the bells and whistles of high-tech analysis, not to clarify, but to obfuscate. These are among the worst forms of sophistry connected to the John F. Kennedy assassination. If you look at President Kennedy's record, it's clear that he was holding at bay a military and intelligence establishment that he inherited that was far to his right and filled with strange Lovian characters. He refused to bomb Cuba during the Bay of Pigs invasion, and then he fired Allen Dulles, Richard Bissell, and George Cable. With the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Joint Chiefs wanted to use the presence of the missiles there as a pretext to bomb the island and oust Castro, once again, Kennedy held them at bay, pursued a far less aggressive policy, established secret back channels with the Soviets through his brother Robert F. Kennedy, and forged a path around the Joint Chiefs and the CIA to avert a crisis that, if mishandled, could have annihilated millions of people.
The whole planet.
At the time he was killed, the National Security Action Memorandum 263, which he signed on October 11, 1963, to begin to de-escalate the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, pull 1,000 troops out by the end of December, and then the remaining out after he won re-election at the end of 65. There's a clear historical record. This is the history. This is not me making up something. This is the record. These are National Security Action Memoranda. You can read them. Kennedy's 1,000 plus days as chief executive showed that he would not succumb to the prerogatives of the brass hats, no matter how hard they pushed. In 1962, Kennedy dumped General Lyman Limnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs and sent him to Europe to get him the hell out of Washington policy circles. Kennedy gave Limnitzer, the heave-ho, not long after he had cooked up Operation Northwoods. Again, historical record, March 13, 1962, a memo to the Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in part reads this: we could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida. We could foster attempts on the lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, even to the extent of wounding in instances to be widely publicized, exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots, the arrest of Cuban agents, and the release of prepared documents substantiating Cuban involvement also would be helpful in projecting the idea of an irresponsible government, unquote. This kind of operation, using patsies and forged documents to hoodwink the American people, looks a lot like the modus operandi of the Kennedy assassination. And lo and behold, it's out of Miami. General Nimitz and Air Force General Curtis LeMay were among the most extreme right-wingers in the military. Initially, these war hawks viewed Kennedy as a lightweight and believed he would go along with their aggressive aims in Cuba and Vietnam. But they soon discovered that Kennedy possessed an unanticipated steel in his use of executive power. He did not hesitate to fire powerful national security personnel if he concluded they were either undermining his leadership or double-crossing him. He sacked Dulles, Bissell, Cable after they misled him on Bay Pigs. And when it became apparent to Kennedy that Limnitzer's prejudices were affecting his judgment, Kennedy sent the father of Northwoods to the equivalent of Siberia when he fired him and sent him to Europe. Let's see. We shouldn't underestimate the huge shift in policy right after the Kennedy assassination. Lyndon Johnson's National Security Action Memorandum 273, signed on November 26, 1963, the day after Kennedy's burial. The historians Robert Dallek and Robert Caro know about this document. This is the pretending on these shows to, he reversed Kennedy's early order, put the nation on the path toward escalating the direct U.S. intervention in Vietnam, toward Americanizing and internationalizing the war, two steps JFK was determined not to follow. The politics of '64 were such that Johnson pretended to carry on the Kennedy policies in Vietnam while secretly reversing them. The earlier constraints on the aggressiveness of the Joint Chiefs that Kennedy had exhibited during the Bay of Pigs, the missile crisis, and formulating policy in Vietnam was now removed. Johnson unleashed the generals. Keep in mind that Lyndon Johnson sent 23,000 Marines into the Dominican Republic in April 1965, and Robert F. Kennedy, the senator from New York at the time, denounced this use of U.S. military force in the Caribbean and linked it to Johnson's Vietnam policy. With this Dominican invasion, which has become a kind of footnote in history, Johnson had signaled coming attractions in Vietnam. And RFK publicly opposed the policy, saying it was a violation of the Organization of American States Charter and the United Nations Charter, and not keeping in the spirit of John Kennedy's Alliance for Progress. Nothing made Robert Kennedy more angry than when Johnson claimed publicly that he was following his brother's policies in Vietnam. He poured 500,000 ground troops in there, and he launched the most sustained bombing in the history of warfare, Rolling Thunder. John Kennedy had indicated on numerous occasions he believed the idea of getting the U.S. involved in a land war in Asia was insane. JFK understood early on what some military officers only learned after tens of thousands of people were killed. Vietnam was the wrong war at the wrong time against the wrong enemy. In 1951, when they visited Vietnam, John and Robert Kennedy had seen firsthand how much the Vietnamese hated the French, as well as the determination of the Vietnamese nationalists to rid their country of occupiers. As Senator John Kennedy had denounced the French neo-colonial war in Algeria, saying that the French were on the wrong side of history. If Kennedy believed the French were on the wrong side of history in Algeria, then surely they were on the wrong side of history in Vietnam too. The government in Saigon was nothing but a reconstituted holdover from the French colonial period. Now I have a lot of comments from quotes from RFK on this, if you're interested. John Kennedy understood this fact, therefore, when the historian Robert Caro and others make the claim that Kennedy would have followed the same course Johnson did in Vietnam, they are grossly mistaken, and Senator Robert Kennedy's critique of the war from 1965 to 1968 bears this out. There was no one in the world who understood John Kennedy's thinking on Vietnam better than Robert Kennedy. They were known to complete each other's sentences. Robert had been his campaign manager in '52 when he won his first statewide Senate race, and in 1960 when he won the presidency. Robert Kennedy also said that the Nixon presidency would be an unacceptable disaster for the country, and vowed to do everything in his power, including running for president himself, to prevent the man who his brother defeated in 1960 from ever becoming president. In the mid-1960s, the media filter of Robert Kennedy's criticisms of Johnson's war always focused on the two men's personal rivalry. They failed to engage the substance of his statements. They framed it as a personal and political rivalry between RFK and LBJ. But if you step past that media filter and examine the substance of what Robert Kennedy was saying, you'll find that he was pointing the way out of Vietnam as early as February 1966, calling for a political solution, a United Nations brokered negotiated settlement that would include the National Liberation Front and a coalition government in the South. When he made that suggestion on February 19, 1966, Hubert Humphrey, George Ball, on Meet the Press, Face the Nation, across the country, they denounced Robert Kennedy, saying he was naive. Humphrey said it'd be like putting a arsonist in charge of the fire department. And Chicago Tribune ran an article with the headline, Ho Chi Kennedy. That's February '66. Think how different the history of the last 50 years would be if the military-industrial complex had been unleashed in Vietnam. With all its social divisions, polarizing effects, Robert Kennedy would not have run for president had it not been for the war. Martin Luther King Jr. wouldn't have been so far out on a limb either, since his April 1967 Riverside Church speech set him apart from the mainstream civil rights organizations. King was no longer a favorite personality of the corporate media, but a pariah after he called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Both men were assassinated at a time when the Vietnam War was raging. It's as if the war's toxicities had seeped into the body politic. One of the unleashing factors of this entire sordid history of America in the last 50 years, what happened in this city 50 years ago yesterday, had these criminals associated with the CIA, who had this operational capability built up in Miami with JM Wave, aimed at Castro, this privatized, semi-autonomous paramilitary group with cutouts, front companies, secret funding sources, and staffed with a menagerie of right-wing fanatics. Had these people not turned this assassination capability inward to kill the president in this city 50 years ago, in all likelihood, the country would have been spared the Vietnam War and all of its attendant ills. And looking back over the last... It was in the context of the Vietnam War, when the military-industrial complex consolidated its power, a power it has yet to relinquish. Today, we might have presidents who talk a big game about peace, but once elected, they quickly become little more than apparatchiks inside the national security state. Even 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, U.S. presidents seldom stand up to the generals and the intelligence establishment. Part of the legacy of our current chief executive, a liberal Democrat who admires John F. Kennedy, is that he will be known as the first president to assassinate an American citizen with a flying robot. So one of the reasons why the John F. Kennedy assassination continues to affect millions of people the way it does, even 50 years later, is the sense that we are still fighting the same battle today. On one side is a military-industrial intelligence complex with its global reach and surveillance state, its CIA and its NSA. On the other side is a vision of an American future that values peace and refuses to measure the country's greatness by its ability to wreak death and destruction. The same corporations that made a killing on the Vietnam War, such as Brown and Root, later KBR, continue to profit from the warfare state today. It appears that the conflict in which Kennedy found himself embroiled at the time when he was killed remains unresolved. It's a domestic struggle between whether the United States is going to be a republic or an empire, a democracy or a police state, a choice of visions between General Limnitzer's Operation Northwoods or JFK's American University speech.